Welcome to The Prescription, the Tax Policy Center's biweekly webcast on fiscal policy. This is one of a series of conversations with state, local, and federal government officials, as well as leading economists and other experts. I'm your host, Howard Gleckman, a senior fellow at TPC and editor of our blog, TaxBox. My guest today is Jacob Bastian. He's assistant professor of economics at Rutgers University and for this academic year visiting at Princeton. His research focus is on how public policy can reduce poverty. And since 2021, he has been intensely studying how a permanent version of the 2021 child tax credit would affect poverty and parental employment. He has his PhD in economics from the University of Michigan and was a postdoc scholar at the University of Chicago. Before we begin, our usual bit of housekeeping. We encourage audience members to submit questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. The event's being recorded and will be posted online on TPC's website. We're using captioning, which you can adjust or turn off with the live transcript button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you'd like to join the conversation on social media, please use the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. And if you'd like to suggest a future guest for The Prescription, just email us at info@taxpolicycenter.org. Jacob Bastian, welcome to The Prescription.
Hey, Howard, good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Glad to have you. Thank you for joining us. As I suspect most of our audience knows, Congress tried last month but failed to restore the relatively generous 2021 version of the child tax credit. In 2021, not only was the credit amount larger than it is today, but it was fully refundable. In other words, you got the full credit whether you worked and earned income or not. The debate over whether the 2021 credit should be restored reignited a long-standing controversy among economists about the effects of government child allowances. A key element of the debate focuses on how these supports affect child poverty and how they affect work. In the minds of some, there's a built-in tension between these two goals. A government subsidy can reduce poverty by giving low-income families more money, but conservatives say the subsidy also discourages work by parents and actually leads to more long-run poverty, not less. Jacob, you looked at the 2021 credit pretty intensively. We can dig into the details in a few minutes, but tell us briefly what you concluded.
Yeah, well, thanks for that introduction. So yeah, I've spent a good chunk of the last year really trying to understand the child tax credit and especially that 2021 version that existed for 6 months where families got those monthly payments, $300 a month for young children, $250 a month for older children under 17. And, you can look at this in a lot of different ways. One of the main ways that we were all waiting for was last fall when the census released its official poverty numbers. And we saw that indeed the child tax credit was responsible for a really big decrease in child poverty. In fact, child poverty reached a record low of about 5%. And so that's evidence that the child tax credit did what it was supposed to do. Now, some people are concerned that, okay, that's true in the short run, but in the long run, maybe families are going to respond by working less. And, that's probably true. Some families would respond by working less. Now, the question is how many? Because, the devil's in the details. Is it 100,000 parents? Is it 1 million? Is it 2 million? And the more parents that stop working, that's going to offset the anti-poverty effect of the child tax credit. So the child tax credit pulled about 3 million children out of poverty in the short run. So the more parents that stop working, potentially in the long run, that's going to mean, okay, they were pulled out of poverty, but actually they fell back into poverty because they chose to stop working. And so, what I show in my research is because of the income effect and the substitution effect, which we can talk about the details later, maybe a few 100,000 parents would choose to stop working. That would offset some of the anti-poverty effect, but instead of child poverty falling by 35%, it would eventually fall by about 30%. So still a really big decrease in child poverty and in deep poverty. Some parents would stop working. That would offset some of the poverty effect, but on net, there would still be a gigantic reduction in child and family poverty.
So if I can summarize the research by Kevin Corinth and Bruce Meyer, all from the University of Chicago, their conclusion is that if the expanded credit, including full refundability, is made permanent, Over time, more than 1 million parents would drop out of the labor force. Numbers are a little different, but they're always over 1 million. This, they say, would wipe out the anti-poverty effects of a permanent, more generous CTC. Scott Winship, who we'll have on in a few weeks, of the American Enterprise Institute, who's otherwise a critic of your analysis, agrees that a more generous credit did help reduce poverty in the short run. But in a recent essay, he also concluded, and I'll quote, "But among those families with the weakest attachment to stable work and family life, it would likely consign them to more entrenched multi-generational poverty by further disconnecting them from those institutions." So as you said, there would be some labor market effect, but it sounds like you think much less than your critics do. So explain a little bit why.
Yeah, so, I've spent the last couple months writing up a short piece, which I think is going to be linked to in the chat, just to compare my approach with their approach. And, to kind of skip over some of the really in the weeds details, some of this is a debate over how large are elasticities. We can point to different evidence and make our case, but there's a few other differences as well. And so, I agree with Scott that we should be really concerned about, overall poverty, but also, the most vulnerable families in society, those at the, kind of on the border of poverty or of deep poverty. Now, in my analysis, I find about a 30% decline in the long run in child poverty. And even among unmarried mothers, which is, kind of a population that people are often, concerned about, because we've shown that programs like welfare reform, the EITC, these women kind of are on the, margin of working or not. So even among this population, I still find about a 25% decline in the children of unmarried mothers in the long run, not just in the short run. And so I do think that, even if some of these mothers stop working, 200,000 or 300,000, these mothers might stop working out of about 11 million unmarried mothers. So there would be some offsetting effect there, but not as much. And, Bruce Meyer, Kevin Corinth, a number of those authors that you mentioned, they argued that about 1.5 million parents would stop working, and that would have a big offsetting effect. They say, okay, short run, the child poverty decrease would be about 35%. In the long run, it would only be about 22%. First point I would make is 22% still isn't bad. A 22% reduction in child poverty is still pretty substantial. Even though I argue that the actual number would be larger than that. And so even if there are these big decreases in parental employment, I have a figure in my paper that's linked to in the chat there. If you look at figure 9, I basically have this choose your own adventure elasticity. Let's say you think elasticities are 1 or 1.5 or 2, whatever you want. I have this figure that shows what the corresponding decrease in child poverty would be, and it's pretty substantial. So even with large elasticities, I still find that there would be, in the long run, a big decrease in poverty and deep poverty. My conclusions differ from some of theirs, like I said, partly because of choosing different elasticities, but there's other factors as well that I think, that I disagree with some of their approach that I think is leading to an exaggeration of the, kind of the negative effects in the long run.
So for the non-economists in the audience, maybe we should step back. I'll try to describe this and tell me if I got it right. There seem to be 2 reasons for the expanded CTC's labor effects. Right? The first is a relatively small income effect. The second is that much larger substitution effect from the sensitivity of employment to changes in return to work. What economists call, what you've been talking about, labor supply elasticity. I'll put it in layman's terms. Tell me if this is an oversimplification. The more benefits you get from not working, the less likely you are to work. Is that a fair kind of description of?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. So I mean, let's take an extreme example. You win the lottery, you win $1 million. Some people will choose to stop working. That's the income effect. Clearly, the child tax credit was less than $1 million, and so there's kind of a consensus that maybe around 100,000 parents would stop working because of the income effect, from $3,000 per year per child. So some parents would choose to stop working, most wouldn't. And actually, there's some evidence suggesting that actually some parents could afford to work. Some parents can't afford childcare. they can't afford a vehicle or transportation costs. So there's some evidence in other contexts that these benefits could also help some families work. So there's kind of, on average, maybe there would be a small negative effect. But actually, if you look at the individual levels, some parents would work more, others would work less. So that's the income effect. And let me just say one more thing about the substitution effect, which is what you were saying. So there's nothing inherent about the 2021 child tax credit that changed the substitution effect. The reason there's kind of a change in the return to work is because the 2020 child tax credit, you can kind of think about it like a mini EITC, earned income tax credit. So the earned income tax credit, a lot of people know it's this wage subsidy. If you work, you get it. If you don't work, you don't get it. So you can kind of think about it like, pre-tax wages are $10 an hour. After-tax wages, with the EITC could be like $14 an hour. So it's a big subsidy. So by removing the 2020 child tax credit, there was like it's kind of like removing a small EITC. And so that's where the substitution effect comes from, not because benefits are guaranteed, but because there was this means, work dependent benefit that went away, that the 21 CTC replaced the 20 child tax credit.
So if Corinth and Meyer are right, just arguendo, and 1 million or 1.5 million parents did drop out of the labor force, would that have a significant effect on child poverty over the long run? Are they right about that? Even if
I'm glad you asked that question. So let's be really clear and really direct here, because I don't want to get caught up in jargon. So I don't want this to be 30 minutes of jargon. So if 1 million or 1.5 million parents stopped working, you would still have a 22% decline in child poverty. Corinth and Meyer acknowledge that. You would also have a big decrease in deep poverty. So deep poverty being families below 50% of the poverty line. So even if 1 million, 1.5 million parents stopped working, you would still have big decreases in child poverty. And that's going to improve health. That's going to decrease stress. That's going to improve, how well children do in school, high school graduation rates. This is likely going to snowball into having positive intergenerational effects as well. So while being concerned about parents stopping work, I think is a valid concern, I think that the positive effects would certainly outweigh any negative effects.
Mm-hmm. Let's step back a minute and think about parents who don't work. What do we know about them? For example, how many live with disabilities that make paid work impossible? How many are caregivers of young children or aging parents? What's the real population of people who could be working but aren't?
Yeah, it's a good question. If you look at the labor force and labor force participation rate or the employment rate of unmarried mothers, it's kind of 75, 80%. This number is going to never get to 100% because you're going to have people who are disabled, they can't work. Maybe that, there's parents that just really enjoy taking care of their kids. If you have 5 kids at home, it's also expensive to pay for childcare. Not everybody has a neighbor or a grandparent that lives, next door. So it's complicated. Now, in this debate, the parents that would stop working presumably are currently working, right? So you have to be currently working in order to stop working. So all of those parents that are currently not working, this 2021 child tax credit, if it was made permanent, would not, have a negative effect on them. It's just people who are currently working that potentially could stop working. And so, if you look at the, long-term trend of working mothers, something big happened in the 1990s. We had welfare reform, we had a big EITC expansion, we had a booming economy. The labor force participation rate and the employment rate of unmarried mothers rose by 12, 13, 14 percentage points. I mean, a big number. About a third of that was because of the EITC, about a third of that was because of welfare reform, and about a third was the economy and other factors. And so potentially, if we had the 2021 child tax credit, it would reduce the return to work and potentially could offset some of that big, 1990s increase in employment, but probably only by, 2-3 percentage points, I would say at the most.
Okay. So you write in your paper, unless one is extremely focused on maximizing the number of working parents as an intrinsic policy goal, the benefits of the 2021 child tax credit seem to outweigh the cost. But isn't that exactly what many conservatives argue, that work itself is a virtue and discouraging parental work will in the long run make their children worse off?
It's interesting. I think that there are two conservative arguments here that kind of push in the opposite direction. So, I was talking to a good friend the other day who had kind of an opposite concern. So on one hand, yes, working is an intrinsic good from a lot of people's point of view, builds character, it demonstrates, kind of work ethic for children. So I think that's one point of view. The other point of view is if these parents and especially mothers are working, they're not spending time with their kids. It's also like a conservative value for parents to be spending time with their kids, helping them with homework, helping raise them. And so the more time that these parents spend working, the less time they're spending raising kids. So I think these are two, I guess you could call them conservative values that kind of push in the opposite direction about, should we be encouraging more mothers to work, parents, mothers to work, or should we be allowing those who want to not work and raise their kids and spend more time investing in their families and communities? Should we let them do that? And so, ultimately, as an economist, I tend to err on letting people make decisions for themselves. I think giving people benefits and then letting them decide how best to use their time. I think that's kind of like, I don't know, libertarian, small government, small c conservatism, I think would, let people make the decisions for themselves about, what's best for them and their family.
A question from an audience member, a good technical question that we probably should answer. Do the estimates of reduced work distinguish between people who reduce their hours and those who stop working altogether?
So it's a great question. So in my paper and in the Corinth and Meyer paper, and in a lot of these papers, we're focused on the extensive margin. It's not to say that some people won't go from full-time to part-time. I think that's absolutely true. Now, most of the evidence though on welfare reform and these tax credits show that people respond on the extensive margin. They're either working or they're not working. Now, clearly some people, maybe they don't pick up that extra shift at the restaurant if they have tax credits coming in. So I think it's true that, what we call an intensive margin effect is also true. But I think kind of most of the big important effects would happen on the extensive margin. But that's kind of a simplistic assumption. And, I think it's a good comment.
Let's step back a little bit. It seems like the assumption behind the child credit and the earned income credit, for that matter, is that parents in the United States with young children can't really support their families with low wage jobs. That seems to be implicit in all of this. Is that really what the issue is here? That there simply is, it's simply not possible if you have a family with children to support them if you're a low wage worker?
I mean, I think that speaks to the importance of these tax credits, because you're right. I mean, trying to raise 2-3 children on minimum wage. I mean, minimum wage varies by state. So I guess at $15 an hour, it's still hard, but maybe doable if you're earning $30,000 a year. But if you're living in a place where the minimum wage is like $9 an hour and you're earning $18,000 a year, good luck. That's very, very difficult, even in places where the cost of living is low. And so I think that's why programs like the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit, together, the earned income tax credit, the child tax credit, they're encouraging work. They are essentially topping up wages. So, if your pre-tax earnings are $20,000, maybe with the EITC, and, depending on which version of the child tax credit you're getting, this could be another $10,000 a year. So I think these tax credits really are important for families. And kind of another interesting aspect is, since the 1990s, the US has decided to essentially run its public assistance through the tax code. We really don't have much in terms of cash welfare anymore. Food stamps is important. We have SSI, we have DI, we have different programs, but really we in the US have decided to run most of our safety net through the tax code. And so, this is going to encourage people to work. And it also kind of maintains public support, because talking about tax credits, I don't know, people feel better about getting a tax credit than they do about getting welfare. So I think there's kind of a psychological element here about, how do we help these families, but also how do we do it in a way that doesn't make them either feel bad, or, how do we maintain public support for these types of transfer programs?
So there's one area where progressives and conservatives seem to agree about the credit, and that's this matter of how far up the income scale it goes. Carthen Meyer in their paper talked about this. They said the credit, they said making it fully available to families making up to $150,000 would make the child tax credit the least cost-effective anti-poverty program in the United States. Is there a legitimate criticism here that we're giving this credit to families that really don't need it?
So it's complicated, as always. So in the child tax credit, until recently, really was like a middle class or an upper middle class tax benefit. Especially if you're thinking about the CTC before 2018, really this was a tax credit that went to families that owed net taxes. So they're not getting the EITC, so they're earning $50,000, $60,000, $80,000 a year. Sorry, I just blanked on what I was going to say.
Sorry. So we're talking about the question about, does it go too far up the income scale?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Howard. So in 2018, TCJA, the tax change happened under President Trump, and it removed in the tax code what are known as exemptions.
Right.
And essentially it removed exemptions, which means, depending on how many people are in your family, if your family is 8 people versus 2 people, exemptions ensured that you owed less taxes. There's no such thing as an exemption. So really the child tax credit now is the main thing in the tax code that's adjusting tax liability by number of kids. So you can think about the child tax credit as doing 2 things. One, it's helping low-income families, and 2, it's helping everybody, including those earning like $500,000. It's adjusting their tax liability by number of kids. Now, should we have one program doing that? Maybe it doesn't make sense. So, but to think about the cost effectiveness of the child tax credit, you really have to think about those 2 different aspects of the program. Now, in my opinion, if we wanted to make the child tax credit, more targeted, if we want to think about a efficient program that pulls kids out of poverty at lower costs, then yes, we should phase the benefits out earlier. Right now, benefits phase out, at $300,000-$400,000. If you have 3 kids, it's not phasing out until over $500,000. So, maybe we want to move that up, start phasing it out at, $100,000, $200,000. Of course, this is more of a political, point than an economic point. President Biden pledged not to raise taxes on families earning below $400,000. Not sure how he picked that number, but because of that number, the child tax credit really isn't phasing out below that. But I would say if we were going to increase the child tax credit kind of in a 2021 format and make it more cost effective, then maybe we want to move that threshold up. And, Richard Reeves has talked about this in his book, Dream Hoarders, but a lot of the tax code go to people who are upper middle class. They earn $100,000, $200,000, $300,000. And, my research, my focus is that programs like the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit go towards lower income families. I'm not as concerned about families earning $300,000.
So we've got about 5 minutes left. Let's talk about some of the alternatives. So one that's out there, of course, is Senator Romney's Family Security Act. It would provide a larger credit for many children than even the 2021 version of the child credit did. It also would phase in the credit faster, starting with the first dollar of earnings, but families without earnings would not be eligible. He'd also reduce the earned income credit and eliminate household filing status. On net, is that an improvement over the existing rules? Are there ways to refine his proposal that you think would make sense?
So my biggest critique of the Romney proposal, because I think it's a step well, I'll say it's a step in an interesting direction. So by reducing the earned income tax credit, I don't love that part, so the earned income tax credit, $65 billion a year. I think that's money well spent. I don't think we should be pulling money away from the EITC to be funding the CTC. So there's analysis out there showing, depending on what income level, how many kids, under the Romney plan, some low-income families would get less benefits. So I'm not a fan of that. Other families would get more, but there's quite a few families that would end up with less benefits. So for me, I think a lot of people feel like the last few years have shown, okay, government can spend money when it wants to. And so if you do want to kind of make something budget neutral, that's fine, but let's pull it from something other than the earned income tax credit. So I am a fan of pairing benefits for everybody, regardless of work status, like the 2021 CTC, but then also encouraging work by phasing in benefits with something like the earned income tax credit. So I think when seen together, this is my ideal policy. Benefits for everybody, regardless of work status, and then still phasing in benefits and essentially increasing the incentive for families to work.
And do you like his idea of a faster phase in? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I am a fan of that part. Yeah, both because it's going to help more families get the maximum credit, and because maybe there's some people that would choose to actually work more because of that. So I do think a steeper phase in is a good idea.
So you mentioned before that so much of our anti-poverty programs are run through the tax code. Romney, of course, would do this through Social Security. Melissa Kearney at Brookings has also proposed Social Security for kids. Would that be a valuable reform, doing this through the Social Security system rather than the tax system?
Ambivalent on this. I've read good things on both sides of this. So one critique I've heard is that, okay, SSI is run through Social Security, but the take-up rate's kind of low. I think the idea is, we want to increase the take-up rate. So the 2021 child tax credit take-up rate was not 100%. It was pretty high. Some surveys say it was in the 60s. That seems implausibly low to me. I think that, the EITC take-up rate's around 85%. I think, it's probably reasonable that accounting for people who got the monthly and for people who ended up kind of postponing it till the end of the year, I think take-up rates probably in the high 80% for the child tax credit. If we think the Social Security Administration could, increase take-up rate, make it easier for people to get, fine. It's not something I have a strong opinion about, but I think it's ultimately a question of, trying to get towards universal coverage.
Yeah, and I'm not sure SSI is a model that anybody wants to emulate. It's got its own problems. Well, we're out of time. Jacob Bastian, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a fascinating discussion. When we return in 2 weeks, our guest will be Scott Winship at the American Enterprise Institute, and Scott will discuss his view that the expanded child tax credits disincentives to work would increase intergenerational poverty. So the debate will continue. Thanks again for joining us.
Thanks, Howard, and happy to follow up with anybody offline if anybody wants to follow up. But thanks a lot for having me here, Howard.
Great. Good to see you.
All right, you too.